Welcome to the Fuban Forum. I'm Michael Rock, a designer in New York City, and I have the great pleasure of being here with Paola Antonelli, a curator and legend from MoMA. Talk tonight, structured around two really big questions: what happened and what's next? And what happened really is what I want to spend most of the time talking about, and really in the interviews that I'll be doing with the Fuban Forum, talking to different people from very different backgrounds about how their thinking has changed over the course of the period they've been working. And this one is very particular because I've really followed Paola's work for so long, and for designers, it's really created a series of milestones for us, and I think it's really important. So Paola, I think it's really telling that both of us share this love of sailing. Sailing is this apt metaphor for design, I think, because it involves this triadic relationship between humans, oftentimes this ferocious environment of the sea, and then this highly technical machine, the sailboat, that connects the two somehow. And everything on a boat is designed to have this very specific function, and it's shaped by millennia of people mastering the art of seamanship. But when it's done at the highest level, there's this intrinsic beauty to the machine, and it creates this aesthetic pleasure that transcends the imperative of transportation, and it creates this intimate bond between the body and the world. And that complex equilibrium between humans and things and environment seems this essential component to what you talk about in your approach. And I think for my generation of designers, you've always been such a central figure. You've taken your training as an architect, I think, at the Politecnico di Milano, and rerouted it into this career organized around exhibitions and books and texts and lectures and presentations that really have shaped the way that we think about design itself. And speaking as a designer, I think that your work performs these two really essential functions. In one sense, it validates contemporary design work because it places it in the context and it allows us to understand the work we're doing in some kind of larger narrative. But it also charts a way forward and focuses our attention on what's coming up. And in that way, I think you really help the practicing designer understand the questions that we should be asking in our work. And I really remember so distinctly when Mutant Materials in Contemporary Design, your first show at MoMA, I think it was 1995, right? It came out. And MoMA, of course, is this institution that established design as the big subject that merited attention of scholarship and of the general public. And your show really signaled this fresh approach about the way a museum could engage the work that we were doing at the time. And it stood in real stark contrast to what we knew from MoMA, which was this kind of good design methodology that the museum had established. And I think it's really interesting that 25 years later now, you're talking about material again in this new show, this work of Neri Oxman you've done titled Material Ecology. And also, that's at MoMA, of course, but also at your massive show, Broken Nature, at the Triennale in Milan last year. And when I look at those shows from that first one in 95 to, the shows you're doing now, I perceive, I guess, and I'm curious if you think so too, this evolution from material toward process, from tangibility to ephemerality, from man-made to the natural. And so I wanted to start off with this really broad question, then what happened over those 25 years, and how is your thinking about the designed object transformed, and how has that transformation demanded new ideas about presentation, I think, in the way that you create shows?
Well, first of all, thank you for a truly lovely introduction. The love for sailing is absolutely true, and the love for the ocean also, and the desire to validate the work that so many designers are doing is also always present in what I do. And that's really what happened in these 25 years. And yeah, you mentioned the, let me go back to, you mentioned the Mutant Material exhibition. So I think it's a good idea to even start showing it. But what happens is that very often we tend to always, like they say that directors always make the same movie. And in a way, I've been making making not the same show, but definitely thinking of the same ideas for a really long time. So you were mentioning Newton materials in contemporary design, and that particular exhibition stemmed from the realization that in the mid-90s, at long last, designers themselves were able to design materials. Up until that moment, every time a designer wanted to make, let's say, a plastic chair, there needed to be a negotiation with manufacturers, because in order to make something out of plastic, one needed to do injection molding, which meant having molds that cost dozens of thousands of dollars made of steel or aluminum. So it was a very complex endeavor. And instead, right around that time, there were these resins that could be cured at ambient temperature that designers could kind of calibrate themselves. There were the first composites. Well, there were composites even before, because fiberglass goes back to World War II, but there were composites that could actually be shaped by designers themselves. So you could lay the fiber and then lay the resin. So all of a sudden, there was a shift in the center of gravity of the design process, and designers had much more control than before. So the exhibition was all about objects designed using new materials or using old materials in an innovative way. And it was an exhibition in which objects were the vessels for process and materials, right? So they were chosen because they used materials in a particular way. They were chosen because of how they expressed materials. And also, one aspect of the exhibition, since you're also talking about the display, was that people could touch. And, you know, it's very rare that you can touch things, especially in a museum. So just like every other curator, I detest plexiglass. I try to always not use plexiglass, but sometimes you really have to, because you have to protect the objects. But with design, and with this particular case, you could have other copies of the object. So we had very deep tables with one sample, and then we had these slanted ledges with the same object, but only presented very close to the public with a little sign saying, please touch. So people would go crazy on one object and leave alone the ones on the table. So it was really quite an interesting experiment. So it was already really an interesting process. At that time, the idea of sustainability was not really in my mind yet. There were some organic materials, but it was not really about that. So mutant materials is the first milestones. Then I can say that, you know, there were many exhibitions that happened between then and now, but I tried, because you and I discussed before, I tried to focus on the ones that dealt with materials and with display. And so another exhibition that I would like to mention is an exhibition that happened in 2008 that was called Design and the Elastic Mind. There was an exhibition that was looking at the coming together of design and science. And in that particular instance, there were some interesting examples of process and also of materials, ranging from computational design and trying to understand how computational design could create almost an indifference to scale. If you look at the upper corner left, you see this bas-relief that is the work of Aranda Lash, of Chris Aranda, of Ben Aranda and Chris Lash, who at that time had taken a nanostructure that had a basis on the number 6, and then had created this bas-relief that could be either a facade treatment or the landscape of another planet. So there was this indifference to scale that was at that time tested, almost as if it were fractal geometry. And then you had already the digital code used as material in the work at the bottom of Simon Hesdens, who had done these these trees, these plants that were digital and projected, but that grew in correspondence to the actual atmospheric circumstances in New York City. There were sensors outside the museum that would measure precipitation, and the plants would grow, and then people would pass by and a camera would catch people passing by, and so the weeds would move as if the wind had moved them and pollinate each other. So there was a lot of computation and also a lot of interest in nature. nature. And that's what I would like to focus on right now. At the top in the center is the early work by Neri Oxman, very early work. She was still in school at that time. And Neri Oxman is a really interesting architect with a background in computational architecture, but with always a very strong passion towards organic design. And her particular vector since the beginning has been that of joining computational architecture and then afterwards also robotics with nature, not organic, just nature, real nature. We'll see to which extent she arrived. So you see, already you see this shift in center of gravity. 95, designers take the power. 2008, scientists and designers work together in a real collaboration and start thinking of what the new materials and the new dimensions of architecture and design can be. And then you get to Broken Nature, which was last year, and then Neri Oxman, where a feeling of the imperative of understanding what to do in front of an environmental crisis adds one very important ingredient or variable to the equation. So designers and scientists together join forces to try and devise material and process strategies that can help us move forward. But 25 years ago, organic design was still very much about imitating the forms of nature, maybe, imitating a little bit more of the shapes. And in 2008, for Design and the Elastic Mind, it was really about understanding how nature does it. But it was still pretty much an old-fashioned way to understand organic design. It's only more recently that this balance has been created. So in Broken Nature was a big exhibition that spoke about the idea of restorative design and was meant to offer citizens, because it was in Milan, and in Milan, Milanese are really interested in design. So I knew that people would flock to the exhibition. So it spoke to citizens, but it offered many different strategies for being more sustainable and more restorative. And some of the strategies were, of course, to use less. Others were to consider waste, not waste, but a new material. Others were do like your grandmother used to do and buy a coat and keep it for your whole life. So many different strategies. And some of them referred to materials. And in particular, they referred to a new generation of materials, sometimes bioplastics. You see here the work of Atelier Luma, the algae lab at Luma, which is a wonderful foundation in Arles, and under the directorship of Jan Bolen, this particular laboratory has been studying algae and also trying to do something really interesting, which is, algae, the proliferation of algae as a byproduct of the havoc that we have wrought on the planet, of the pollution, the phosphorus that we have just like thrown into rivers and lakes. So there's a proliferation of algae. But interestingly, what the Atelier Lumen, this workshop, is doing is going around the world and teaching people to use their own algae to make biomaterials that can then be 3D printed into vessels from that place. So they did one in Istanbul, they did one in Arles, they're doing one in Sardinia of these workshops. So it's a way to actually almost like exorcise our evil deeds and transform them into a continuation of our material culture. So this is one of the examples of materials that were in Broken Nature. Algae also continues in the work, for instance, of Julia Lohmann. It's interesting because in this new phase of organic design, in which there is really a collaboration with nature, the stars are seaweed, mushrooms, and silkworms somehow, and bees, also bees. But so seaweed is used a lot. Julia Lohmann here uses it almost as if it were old parchment or, leather. So she not only does she make these beautiful structures, but also teaches people how to fix them. The moment something breaks, you just take another piece of algae and you wet it and then you put it on top. So it's new ways of making things that change from the past, not only because they involve nature, but also because they take advantage of crafts and also involve people in the making of them. So it's a completely new phase in the way we think of design and in the way we think of the world, one that takes into account old wisdom and community traditions and material cultures. And of course, I was telling you about mushroom mycelium. On the left-hand side is the work of David Benjamin and the living. David is based in New York City, incredibly interesting architect that does a lot of work with materials and also with computation. The structure that you see there was at MoMA PS1, and it was all made of bricks, the bricks that you see at the bottom left, that are made of corn stalk and mushroom mycelium. You know, the mushroom mycelium is what mushrooms use to attach themselves to trees. It's a very strong and completely natural glue. And these bricks are cured, are cook themselves without any need to inject other chemicals. So it's a way to find these new materials that are much more copacetic with nature because they are biodegradable, even though the degradation might take dozens of years. So these are examples of this new way that culminate, this new way to materials that culminates in the work of Neri Oxman.
Let's talk a little bit about the people that you find, because as we go into Neri's show, you know, because you show Neri's part of Design the Elastic Mind is really a student you're discovering, and then, you know, 20 years later or 12 years later, whatever it was, you know, now showing a kind of someone who's really out in the world and really matured as an artist. And you know, how are you finding people, and how do you locate somebody who's working with algae, and how do you find the people that you find?
Well, it's funny because it happens in many different ways. I mean, I have a Twitter handle that is Curious Octopus. That happened because I was giving a lecture many years ago, and people asked me, how do you do research? And I said, I don't really know what to tell you. I mean, I just go in all directions. I'm like a curious octopus. And a friend was in the audience, and she said, you need to use that as a Twitter handle. And it was already taken, believe it or not, but she knew people at Twitter. So she muscled the guy out of that handle and gave it to me. I mean, it was just like really a good friend. But it truly is that way. You know, in the case of Neri, I met Neri through another architect, through Enrique Norten, who's an architect, a Mexican architect that had a studio in New York at that time. And he knew, because what I do, whenever I do a show, the first thing that I do is I tell the whole world, you know, because that's the best way to do it. If you want to find out what's going on, just let everybody know what you're doing, and people will let you know what they know. And so, yeah, no, that's my strategy. I mean, there's no secrecy, you know, it's the best way to do it. And then you give credit, you know, also that's important. So Enrique is the person that said, there is this woman that's doing her PhD at MIT, you should really talk to her. That's how it happened. And immediately I had a feeling, you know, let me go to that particular slide. What Neri was doing at that time, and this is exactly what was in Design and the Elastic Mind that now is on display in the Material Ecology exhibition, which is an exhibition only dedicated to Neri's work. So what she was doing at that time is she was looking at natural behaviors or natural phenomena, for instance, the bark of a birch tree in Northern Europe. And then she was trying to, computational architecture, extract from this object, from this element, an algorithm, a sort of mathematical recurrence that could become part of a library of behavior that then could be redeployed, say, in a facade treatment. For instance, you have to do a facade treatment for buildings in conditions of limited sun conditions. You have to maximize the absorption of sun energy. Well, you know what? That bark of that particular tree might be useful, so that algorithm could then be reused. And I really loved it because that's what she was doing. She was creating a library. It was almost meta design because it could be then for the use of generations to come. I loved the idea. I loved the I loved the generosity. It was one step beyond biomimicry. You know, biomimicry was one of the evolutionary phases of organic design, but it was very much about taking the gecko and making adhesive out of it. So it was about being inspired and then imitating. And instead, Neri was distilling. I loved it. You know, there was something, and also what I loved particularly was also her ability to render these algorithms in demo objects of incredible beauty. That kind of formal ability sometimes was almost to her detriment because it created a distraction from the essence.
The objects were too beautiful?
Almost, but then it was a strange moment in which people were afraid of beauty because they thought it might be styling. So I had to get over it because the way I think about it right now is that this kind of formal elegance is a way to really deliver the message. Neri worked on this project that I truly loved that is called Silk Pavilion. What she and her group, there's a great group that she works with at MIT that's called the Mediated Matter Group. It's a group that's composed of scientists, engineers, textile designers. There's all sorts of people that come together on these projects. So they started studying the behavior of silkworms, behavior of silkworms in different conditions of light, of temperature, of like space, and they really studied it in detail until they knew it so well that they created the conditions, even the architectural conditions, for silkworms to become the construction workers for human beings. So it's really interesting because in a way it was about letting silkworms do what silkworms do and preparing the conditions for them. So it was about control and then letting go. So a new balance in the process in which you have to trust because a reaction is going to happen that you cannot control perfectly, but that is going to surprise you in a beautiful way, perhaps. So we really loved this. We proposed it to MoMA for the atrium. It was not accepted at that time. We kept on thinking until this particular idea became the main commission for the exhibition that is today at MoMA. But it was evolving from the initial idea. So in this case, the silkworms are not only the construction workers, but are also the architects because the conditions that are set for them are looser than they were before. So this is also the beauty. And see, there's a continuous evolution. First, it's architects and designers taking control from biologists and chemists. Then it's about designers learning to release control to other species that might be doing a better job at something in particular than they would. So it's fascinating.
If Mutant Materials was about taking control of the making, you know, in a way that you couldn't before, but now this way of giving up that control again, but in a totally different way.
Yeah, it's an attempt, you know, but see, for instance, at the bottom right, that little picture with those little black squares, those were the initial studies to understand how silkworms spin their silk thread. And really, I think that the Mediated Matter Group and Neri went through hundreds of those studies to understand really what silkworms want to do. And then they set the conditions. In this particular case, what you see here is a water-soluble fabric that becomes the scaffold for silkworms to work on. And in this case, there were 17,500 silkworms. And because it's water-soluble, and silkworms, before they start spinning, just pee and poo with abandon. And so they would liquefy the fabric, and then they wanted to fill the holes that they had made. So it was really fascinating. It's very, when you go to MoMA and you're under this pavilion, you see these little dots, and that's the pee and the poo of the silkworms. It was important for us to show that the objects, however beautiful, were just demos of the process. So we always had the objects, and what you're looking at here, these beautiful death masks that employ different materials and even bacteria to color them. Then we had the lab table with the prototypes that show how the mediated matter group and Neri got to that particular material. And then we had videos showing the process. So it was really important to show the process, and that's what we were doing also in Newton Materials, and we're doing it even now with Neri, and we were doing it a lot also for Design and the Elastic Mind. So making people understand the process.
And obviously with the pandemic, and it really changes so many different conditions. And so I'd like to spend a little time speculating sort of where you imagine your next show, where do you imagine we as designers go from here? And what's the new goal for us?
There are two shows that I'm thinking of that I'm not sure that I will be able to do them at MoMA anytime soon, because after the pandemic, the budgets have been cut, and the time of the exhibitions has been extended. So I might have to find another platform or another museums, but there are two. One is about interspecies design. So it is quite clear that as human beings, and I can speak for the West especially, I don't know enough about the East or the South of the world, but we have not thought, or we have not at all put ourselves in the shoes of other species. We have designed for ourselves without any regard for anything else. And right now, we're imitating nature, we're working with silkworms and bees, but we don't know yet that we're really doing the right thing, because communication is very difficult. So I don't know yet what interspecies design is. I'm trying to understand it also by looking at art. I've been in my career a bit diffident of art, because art attracts so much attention, and instead design is always like a little bit like a poor cousin. So I've been always with a chip on my shoulder. But I have to say that when it comes to understanding these new concepts, art can be incredibly interesting. Thinking of Boyce and his coyote and understanding what it means to live with other species is fascinating. But this is one of the exhibitions that I'm thinking of. And the other one is an exhibition on systems, because it's very important to understand that we live in systems. So how can I convey, using design, the fact that as human beings we live in systems? That was one of the goals also of the Triennale, to give people a sense of the systemic nature of everything that we do. Now, of course, the term systemic has become very recurrent in the United States, attached to racism, which is fabulously interesting. But I think that because racism is such a visceral feeling, either it's a feeling of disgust or it's a feeling of hidden attraction, but it's visceral nonetheless. The understanding of its systemic nature, I think, is something that really drives this concept of system home, in my opinion. So these two are two exhibitions that I'm thinking of, and that I think really talk about aspects that are crucial to the work of designers, and that are crucial to also the world and culture.
And I think that for our audience, I think that it's imperative for us also to think about these audiences. And one of the aspects of the pandemic, I think, and the fact that you've been doing Zooms all around the world, is that we can suddenly expand audiences in this really different way than we've been before. And I think that's a really amazing opportunity. So I want to thank Fuban also for hosting us tonight, and for all our listeners in Taiwan, because we're glad to be here with you.
We really are, but I wish I were there in person. I can't wait to travel again.
Right. Thank you, Paola. And
Thank you, Michael.